The Green Mile is a green pathway used by condemned prisoners to walk from their cells to the execution room, where they contemplate their actions and mortality. Paul, an elderly man, wakes up in a retirement community following a nightmare. A waiter gives him 2 pieces of dry toast and says he's worried about Paul's long walks outside, but she lets him carry on with his routine. As the other residents watch TV, Paul starts to cry when he sees an old movie of Fred Astaire dancing to the song Heaven. Elaine, a friend of Paul's, follows him out of the room, sensing that Paul is feeling nostalgic about the movie. Telling Elaine his story, he describes his time working as a prison guard during the Great Depression, watching over death row, the Green Mile, because of its green tile flooring. In 1930, at the Louisiana State Prison, a young Paul suffered from an acute urinary infection. Guard Percy, disruptive behavior, annoys the others as he loudly declared, "Dead man walking," during the inmate's arrival. John Coffey, the Walking Dead, is a massive and muscular black man, with a childlike demeanor who is afraid of the dark. Paul tells Percy to stop acting in such a rude manner and find a job outside of the death row. In a fit of rage, Percy breaks the fingers of a laughing prisoner named Dell by hitting him with his baton. Paul reviews John's case. A search team is sent after 2 missing females. They find John sobbing and holding their bodies. The group is certain that John committed the crime. Paul is greeted outside by Hal, the warden, who informs him that Percy is the governor's wife's nephew. Percy has submitted an application to work as an administrator at a mental health hospital in order to increase his salary and hours. Paul thinks Percy wants to transfer someone to death row first. Hal states that his wife Melinda experiences excruciating headaches. Later that night, Paul shares the events of the day with his wife, Jan. She is more concerned for his health. Paul refuses to seek medical attention for his wee-wee infection. Rumor has it, Mickey Mouse was spotted in the prison. Guard Brutus catches sight of him, but Mickey escapes into a storage room. Later, Percy obsesses over finding Mickey. Paul warns Percy not to escalate tensions among the already stressed inmates. Percy threatens repercussions if touched, but Paul warns him that threats won't be tolerated. Afterward, Paul discusses Percy's future job opportunity, but Percy expresses a desire to be directly involved in executions before leaving. The next day, inmate Dell discovers the mouse, naming it Mr. Jingles. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Jingles demonstrates an unexpected talent by fetching a spool of thread. Dell decides to keep Mr. Jingles as a pet. Percy suggests they procure a cigar box for Mr. J. A new inmate, Bill, is set to join death row, known for his troublemaking tendencies. Hal receives the distressing news that Melinda has an inoperable brain tumor. Paul's urinary infection worsens overnight, causing him significant pain. Percy and Harry bring Bill from the mental hospital, who appears sedated. Upon arrival, Bill attacks the guards and incapacitates Paul. Bill nearly strangles Dean. Paul urges Percy to intervene. Percy is paralyzed from shock. Luckily, Brutus subdues Bill. Paul instructs others to report the incident and seek medical attention. While alone, he collapses from the intense pain. John asks to speak with Paul and grabs Paul's groin. After a blinding flare of light, John releases Paul and expels a cloud of spores, saying he helped before growing tired and falling asleep. Later, Paul's urinary infection has vanished. He returns home and shares a night of passionate love with his wife. The next morning, Paul feels that John is a kind man. Paul decides to pay a visit to John's public defender, Bert, who remains convinced of John's guilt, comparing his kindness to a dog attacking his son without reason. Following day, Paul gives John a loaf of cornbread from his wife as a thank you for his help. John shares with others, but excludes Bill due to his racism. This angers Bill, leading to confrontations with guards, resulting in him being restrained and sent to solitary confinement. Dell performs a successful show with Mr. Jingles, while Paul puts Percy in charge of Dell's execution rehearsal. After a brief moment of distraction, Percy approaches the cells too closely, and Bill grabs him through the bars. Percy wets himself in fear. Dell enjoys Percy's humiliation. Following day, Mr. Jingles bolts across the room. Percy stomps on Mr. Jingles. Dell screams. Paul gives John the mouse when he asks for it. When John coughs and sends another cloud of spores flying, the guards look on in dismay and horror. Mr. Jingles, still brand new, dashes across the room. Before walking the mile to the electric chair, John looks after Mr. Jingles. Percy hooks Dell up to electrodes. Paul observes that the sponge is dry. Electricity flares up and punishes Dell. The audience gasps in horror as Dell is executed in a torturous manner. Paul and the guards look on anxiously. John prays as he senses Dell's pain. Dell's suffering goes so far as to ignite, resulting in a panic and evacuation. Brutus commands Percy to put out the fire. Hal demands information. Paul insists Percy accepted his new job. Paul returns to the mile. John, grief-stricken, believes Mr. Jingles felt the pain and fled during Dell's suffer. Paul and his wife visit Hal and Melinda, witness Melinda's illness. Paul invites the other guards to dinner and discusses John's healing acts. The other guards agree to help. Paul and his team execute a plan to put Bill to sleep. Percy is placed in a straitjacket and placed in a padded room as retribution for his actions. As they head out, Bill suddenly grabs John's arm, and John sees an event that horrifies him before Bill is finally asleep. Once they arrive at Hal's house, John finds Melinda upstairs. John touches her face, resulting in a bright light and an earthquake. Hal breaks down in tears as he sees Melinda get better instantly. Melinda saw John in her dream. She gave John a pendant bearing St. Christopher's mark. They made it back to prison. John feels unwell. They take Percy out of isolation. John grabs onto Percy and releases spores into his mouth, causing him to go dazed. Percy immediately shoots Bill in the chest with his revolver as the others grab hold of him. After this, Percy coughs up the last of the black spores. Paul questions John's motives for doing this. John offers his hand. Paul held on to him. Immediately, an intense flashback reveals that Bill was a farm worker who abducted the girls, threatening them. Paul sees Bill was responsible for the double murder. When Hal and the cops get to Mile, Percy looks to be in a coma. Paul denies any involvement. Percy was admitted to a mental health facility as a permanent patient, not an administrator. The guards, now aware of John's innocence, they discuss John's desire to escape and the upcoming execution. John states that he can feel the pain of others and see the execution as an act of kindness. He requests a flicker show as his last wish. John is astounded when he sees Fred Astaire dancing to heaven, referring to them as angels. On the day of John's execution, Paul takes John's pendant and promises to return it after his death. The guards take John to the auditorium, where he feels hostility from the audience, including the dead girl's parents. He is asked to focus on the guards' sympathy. John is strapped to a chair, and Paul ensures the sponge is wet before placing the cap. As the chair is activated, John is gone. Paul puts the pendant back on his neck as promised. After these events, Paul and Brutus requested a transfer to a youth corrections facility. Elaine questions the accuracy of Paul's story. They visit a wood cabin where they see Mr. Jingles. Paul, now 108 years old, believes John infected him and Mr. Jingles with life. It may be his punishment for killing a miracle of God, and he must watch his loved ones grow old and die before his own death. Paul contemplates his life at Elaine's funeral. He believes we all owe a death, but sometimes the Green Mile seems too long. Perhaps Mr. Jingles will know.